Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's Out of Office stream. We are talking all about the spring reverb in the VOX amps, the AC series amps. We're using the AC10 this week because that is what I have at home with me. This actually has a digital reverb, but we're going to talk the differences between digital spring reverb, a spring tank like in the AC15 or AC30, as well as using an external reverb going into your amp, and show some back and forth differences with what those sound like. So I have a bunch of surf rock stuff ready. That's kind of the spring reverb sound. I've got some other classic in my mind spring reverb sounds, and we're just going to run through some stuff. I am playing my built Relevator LS into the AC10. You are hearing this through the external speaker output into my universal audio aux box. That's giving you a nice emulation of a Celestion 112 British type speaker cabinet. The AC10, of course, has a 110-inch cabinet, so slightly different than if you were in the room with me, but that's the best way to get the audio across to you. And that is the whole setup. I do have a reverb pedal off screen here that I'll pick up and show you when it's on, but that's for later, just to show an example of what that difference is between a pedal before the amp and the amp's reverb itself. So if you leave any comments in the stream, I'm going to keep an eye on those. If you see me looking over to my other screen here, I'll be looking at the comments, and feel free to ask any questions if you need me to elaborate on something, and we'll talk about reverb together for a little bit. So spring reverb to me ties so well into the VOX legacy for a lot of reasons, but I think the biggest reason is because the Shadows, one of the first big artists that used VOX, have one of the biggest surf rock songs just coated in spring reverb. And so you can go back and listen to this record and hear VOX in the 60s or late 50s, and really hear that actual spring reverb sound coming out of an AC15, using the kind of weird spring reverb that VOX created to avoid patents with other spring reverb designs. So the VOX has always had a classic kind of odd spring reverb sound to it, a little bit unique compared to other things, and you can hear that on the Shadows record. This song you'll recognize. You might not recognize it as being by the Shadows or being called Apache, but that's what this song is, and this is kind of this classic VOX sound to me. So you might recognize that riff from, what is it? The Hustle. That is kind of a classic spring reverb sound in my mind, and that is actually from the Shadows. That is an AC15. From all we, as far as we know, that's what the Shadows were using at the time. So that's a really great example of this sound. So when I think surf rock specifically, I'm thinking this brighter kind of springy sound from the reverb, but also from the amp settings. So I have the gain set fairly low. The gain is about 10 o'clock, just barely turned up, and then the volume set to compensate for that, just to get levels right here in the room and coming across on the stream. I have the bass control set pretty low to about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and the treble set fairly high to about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. If you haven't heard this terminology for knob settings before, it's just like a clock, and noon is pointing straight up, 10 o'clock would be, or 9 o'clock would be, turned down from there, and 3 o'clock vice versa, and kind of just where the hand on a clock would be pointing. So like I said, gain set fairly low, bass fairly low, and treble a little bit high, which gives you this like bright. It's still punchy. It has that low mid-range, which that bass control is giving us a little bit back as we turn it down. But the high control is really bringing out that chime. And that gives you those really nice lead tones from, listening to these records. A lot of it is a rhythm guitar player and a lead player. And so the lead player would be just playing that simple, and that allows that tone to really push through and become the focus. So that's how the amp is set, and I'm not really going to touch that for a while. I might once we get into some later stuff, but that's where we are to start. So from here, there is a lot more that we can get into looking at those classic surf rock tones. There's if we turn the reverb up a little, the reverb was set at noon. If I turn the reverb up to closer to 1 or 2, we can get something like so if you hear when I'm muting the string with my picking hand and giving it this really sharp attack, and what that does to the spring reverb, and it responds slightly differently with the digital spring reverb in the AC10, but what that does is give you this splash. It really pushes the reverb to when you have an actual spring tank that's responding to the attack and vibrating more than if you were to play that legato or more smoothly. So to get a lot of those splashy, or a lot of people refer to it as drippy, spring reverb tones, a big way I've found is to just palm mute just slightly to really accentuate it. That is the first really big difference you're going to hear from the AC10 or AC30S1 digital spring reverb to the AC15 or AC30 spring tank. With a real spring inside the amp, you can do things like slap the amp and it'll get the spring going, or really exaggerate that pushing of the spring. If I turn the spring all the way up, it gets splashy. There's a little bit of drip there. It really gets you that tone, but nothing will respond like a real spring. So if you're primarily a surf player or want to get that specific drip and response to that pick attack, that's something to take into consideration when you're looking at the AC10 versus AC15 or AC30, which has the same digital spring reverb, versus the AC30S1, I'm sorry, with the digital spring reverb, versus the AC30 C2, the standard AC30. So with this reverb maxed out like we did, I could play Miserlou and get that big, classic surf rock sound. I'm sure that's probably the first thing that comes to most people's mind when we're talking surf rock. Problem is, I do not have the picking dexterity to play that song well, so I'm going to play it the simplified version. Just know when you're doing that fast picking with this hand, that's pushing the spring to splash more. So a lot of this surf rock playing style came out of how to manipulate the spring, and that's really something that you can take into surf rock or non-surf rock music that you're playing yourself. So this is that Miserlou riff. So, that is to me that really classic surf rock sound. And like I said, that key is really that getting used to doing that pick attack in an unnatural way, almost like slap bass to a degree, where you're really pushing the string. If I can, raise my guitar up in a kind of weird way so you can see and avoid the mic being in the way. If you look at how I'm moving just my thumb and finger holding the pick, it's really sharp, really pushing it. So that to me, that's what I found to be the key, learning some of the surf rock stuff and manipulating the spring reverb itself. Of course, there's plenty of surf that doesn't manipulate the spring reverb that way, and I think there are other key parts of that sound. If you joined us for the stream last week when we were talking about the Beatles, part of their sound is the tone, part of their sound is that songwriting and how they write a chord progression. And I think that's the same with some surf, and especially the Beach Boys. So if I turn down the spring reverb setting again, we're back to about noon. So if you're just joining us, we're playing into the AC10 with the spring reverb set, the digital spring in the AC10 set to about noon. The gain is set to about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, as is the bass control, and the treble's turned up closer to 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. And we get this sort of bright, chimey, really vintage surf sound, or just, very summery, classic rock and roll sound. So I had played, when we started the stream, Surfer Girl. So as you can hear, there's two things creating that surfy sound. The first is that chord progression, like I said. So it's fairly simple, but it follows this almost barbershop quartet type harmony, where you have a D major, F sharp minor, G major, A major. So really simple to start out, but then you get that D major, D7, G, G minor. And that, to me, that second half of that chord progression, that is just total surf sound to me. Even if I turn the spring reverb off, I'll only do this for a second. If I play that same thing, it's missing part of it. The spring really adds to it, but it's still that same sound. So, to some degree, the spring isn't the only thing carrying this style. And then if I turn that back up, the other big part of this is the way I play. So if I strum those chords out, that sounds really nice and really dreamy, and the song's a bit of a ballad, so it makes sense. But if I do that interesting balance of how I'm picking it and strumming the whole chord, you're getting those splashes of reverb and really reminding you that this is a surf song. It almost is like reminiscent of a wave. Instead of just being smooth, it's kind of up and down. So, of course, there's a lot of variation you can play within this, and not all surf songs are done that way, and not all Beach Boys songs are done that way. If I turn the spring down a little bit, now we were at noon, we're set to about 10 o'clock now, and I can play something like... So very different. This is later Beach Boys, Good Vibrations off of Pet Sounds. And this song has a very different feel to it because of how they're playing and the way the song is structured. But it also keeps that surf sound with, I'm playing that lead guitar part, which is just arpeggiating, or not arpeggiating, but picking behind the vocal line. And of course, Pet Sounds is this beautifully orchestrated album where you have chords played on guitar and strings and all this stuff happening. But it keeps that surf feel because of the little splash, and it's got this like weird swing to it. So that, to me, that all, those things that we showed so far kind of encompass surf. And that is sort of the quick primer on using the AC model spring reverb or digital spring reverb, depending on which model you have, to get those surf tones. So I said this a few times already, but just in case you have joined us since then, we are playing right into the AC10 with my built relevator, and I have the gain set to about 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, fairly low. The bass is set about the same at 9 or 10 o'clock, and the treble is set a bit higher at about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. And this gives you that chime where you're getting lots of treble and lots of low mid-range, but a little bit of less bass, so it's not as thick and kind of filling up the spectrum, which is that really classic VOX chime, but also that classic rock and classic surf rock tone. So the reverb you can set to taste, and for different styles, like Beach Boys was low, Dick Dale, we turned that all the way up, and we got a nice splash from it. There's a lot of room to play here and really find your style within that. Now I have some modern surf rock influenced things I want to show you, and that can orchestrate a couple other ideas about how to use the spring reverb. But first, of course, there's lots of spring reverb that isn't surf rock in classic songs as well as more modern songs. So this is just a favorite of mine. It's a really nice Grateful Dead part. So if I turn up the bass a little bit, so now we have still gain at about 10 o'clock, but the bass is closer to 11. And I'm going to turn the spring reverb up to about 11 as well. And it'll give you this like really nice kind of like twang country, or it's the Grateful Dead, so it's really this sort of jammy psychedelic thing just with using the spring reverb. So we get So there you go, some non-surf spring reverb, kind of classic tone. That's a Grateful Dead song. So that one's New Speedway Boogie. I believe that's the name. And that's just a really great, that was the first thing that came to mind, a riff that's showing spring reverb without feeling too surfy. Of course, you can find that in a lot of things. It's definitely in some Beatles songs. It's definitely in some Neil Young. So it's just searching and finding how different artists use this. And I do want to talk about the difference between an onboard, like built into your amp, reverb tank as opposed to an external reverb tank or pedal. And we'll get into that in a second. But there was a question. I want to pull this up in the chat so I say it right. So Bruce asked, how does the AC10 compare to an AC30 besides the weight? And so that's a really great question. You can think of the AC10 like a scaled down version of just the top boost channel. So you have the top boost channel with the bass and treble control, independent gain and master volume. You also have this digital spring reverb that you're hearing, where the AC30 C2 has a real spring tank in it. So for what we're talking about today, that kind of makes the biggest difference. Although you are hearing that the Digital Reverb has some of that splash to it. It does a really nice job at approximating those tones. If you're not specifically a surf rock player, I don't know if you would feel that difference. And even if you are a surf rock player, you can get that pushed splash thing like we've shown. So if you're familiar with the AC30S1, you can think of that and the AC10 to be about the same thing besides power handling. So the AC10 is obviously lower wattage, so it'll break up a little bit sooner. I particularly like the AC10 for more distorted tones, although you're hearing clean and it does that very well, and there's plenty of volume available. And the digital reverb. So the other thing is the speaker, where the AC30C2 obviously has two 12-inch speakers. The AC30 or the AC10, I'm sorry, the AC10 has one 10-inch speaker. So it's a bit of a difference in sound. I particularly like 10-inch speakers. I have some friends who don't like them. It's a different sound and something you might want to try. There are, of course, other options. The AC15 will have that one 12-inch speaker and real spring tank. The AC30S1 will have a one 12-inch speaker and the digital tank and a little bit more lightweight. So there's some variability between all those four models. And then obviously the AC4 doesn't have the reverb, so that's why I haven't been talking about it. But lots to find between all of those. So thank you for that question, Bruce. The only other thing I see for now is Michael said he loves the built guitar. I'm glad you are liking it. I really love this guitar, and it's been working for some of that versatility between different things we're showing. This has the shape I think of when I'm thinking surf rock and spring reverb, but a hardtail bridge, so I can't do some of those fun pitch bends with the vibrato arm. But otherwise, this has been great. It's the only guitar I have at home, so I'm glad it is working out for these streams and showing a lot of different styles of music. So on from here, I wanted to show a few things that are taking beyond the spring reverb setup and a little bit more modern, inspired by spring reverb. So I'm talking like the kind of lo-fi indie rock from the 2000s to now. There are a lot of artists that come to mind, and they all do it in different ways. So using the same setting that we were using for the Grateful Dead. So bass turned up to about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, gain set at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, treble up at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and the spring reverb set to about 11 o'clock, so not too much of it. We can get this really nice Courtney Barnett type sound. And so that is really just a very simple chord progression that Courtney Barnett uses in a few songs. That specifically is Avant Gardener, which is a really reverbed out kind of spacey song. So if I turn that reverb up, now it's set to about 2 o'clock, and I play the same chord progression. That gives you a sound that really is what a lot of the other things I'm going to get into and show you for the rest of the stream are doing, which is using the spring reverb in a different way as opposed to that sharp pick attack to get that drip and splash from the reverb. Just let it wash over the whole chord progression. And this was really popular, like I said, with these lo-fi indie rock artists that maybe were recording themselves or finding different ways to do things. And I think it resonated with a lot of people because it's this nice kind of calming sound as opposed to turning the reverb all the way off on the amp. And the chord progression sounds great, but it's missing some of that space and depth, especially when you're doing just electric guitar and vocal, or electric guitar and a drummer and vocal, or something like that. So that is really another big use for spring reverb. It's the second thing on my list when I think spring reverb after the surf rock tones. So before I move on to a few others like that, Zarif, I believe is, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but Zarif asked, what do you think of the new Cambridge 50 and how does it handle compared to the AC10 or AC30s? And the way I would answer that question is that the Cambridge 50 is a really, really capable amp, especially if you're going to use all of those amp models. We often get questions when we do Q&As on Instagram or when we do these streams where people are asking, if I'm just playing at home, what amp should I get? And usually I say to that, you either get the Cambridge 50 for its versatility, because you'll have 11 amp models and a lot of range to cover. Plus it has that new tube, which makes the digital amp models respond the way a tube amp does, because it has a tube in the preamp section. So you don't feel that sterile digital thing. We've worked it out, so you hopefully don't even notice that it is a digital or solid state amp at all. So it's really impressive in that way. It does have a reverb on it. It has a spring reverb as well as a hall reverb, and both of them are really nice. If you use the Tone Room software, you can get that mix up a little bit more than on the face of the amp. If I were to play surf rock and wanted to keep the budget, that compared to the other suggestion I usually give, which is the AC4, that really does it, because Cambridge 50 has a reverb, AC4 doesn't. AC4 will give you that real breakup from a tube amp because it has a tube preamp and power amp section, where the Cambridge 50 is giving you some of the breakup and all of the feel, but it's still a modeling amp. So there are some advantages with that versatility, some disadvantages because you don't have that singular focused classic amp architecture. So compared to the AC10, it will, it's kind of an even choice in, choosing which reverb do you like. They're different reverbs, and which responsiveness do you prefer when you are talking about just using one amp model on the Cambridge 50 and just getting these, AC30 reverb tones. But if you want that versatility, Cambridge 50 can't be beat. That is easily the one. I have one at home with me, and I've done another stream, and we'll have more with it. That's easily the one I play the most outside of the streams, because I can turn it into a bunch of different amps. So it's it compares in some ways and has advantages over the AC series amps in some ways and disadvantages in others. So it's really deciding what you like about it and what you don't. So hopefully that helps. I know there's a lot of info we could get into just that. Maybe we could do another stream comparing side by side Cambridge and an AC10 or AC4, but for now I'm going to move on to some more of these indie rock tones from the 2000s. If I turn the gain up a little bit, and turn the volume down to compensate. So I set the gain to about 1 o'clock and kept the EQ the same. So bass is about 11 o'clock, treble is about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and set the spring reverb to about noon. We get this really nice sort of saturated reverb, but I'm not going to show you the reverb pedal yet. I'm going to do that comparison in a second. But what is nice about this is when you're using a spring reverb in the amp, or any reverb in the amp, like if you're using the Cambridge 50 and you have the hall reverb setting, something like that, you have your breakup from the preamp section and the preamp tubes before the reverb. So this is like having your distortion pedal before your reverb pedal. Now, if you use a reverb pedal and you have no effects loop in your amp, you're going to have the reverb before that breakup and before that distortion. So two different flavors of the same sound. Because of what I typically play, I like both, and that's why I like to use both a reverb pedal and amp reverb. But some people prefer one or the other. specifically for these surf rock things, I really prefer the amp reverb being after that breakup. So here is a little bit more of a distorted reverb sound. This is a Best Coast song. So as you can hear, that adds this this really nice saturation to the reverb, but the reverb itself is staying relatively clean because it's the amp that's saturating before the reverb. So that is, I think, the sound of this era that I'm trying to show. This sort of like, surf rock revival or lo-fi indie rock thing from the early 2010s up until recently. Another example of that, a bit closer to that Grateful Dead riff in sound, but using the same settings as this. The Best Coast song we just did is this Kurt Weill riff. That's So that is really the sound of, in my opinion, amp distorting and sounding full with that bass turned up a little bit, but the spring reverb after that breakup and after that preamp section. So if I switched the reverb off, if I pull that down, and I do have a reverb pedal here, this is a bit of an overkill of a pedal for this. I'm just using it as a simple plate reverb, so a bit of a different flavor of reverb, but the same idea, just because I don't want the comparison to be spring to spring and how they do it differently. So using the plate reverb here going into the amp, only change I made was turning the reverb on the amp off. And I'm going to play that same riff. Turn my guitar up first and... My bad. So just for comparison, I'm going to turn the pedal off and the spring reverb back up to noon, and here's the same riff. So hopefully you could hear in that there is a very different sound in how the amp reverb is filling out the space, but not saturating or adding to how that breakup of the amp lingers as chords ring out. But when you have the pedal, it has, because it's before the preamp section, it's contributing to that breakup. So as the reverb rings out going into the amp, it's going to change how those chords, decay and how that saturation then decays. So I just saw pop up in the comments that Carolus said the AC10 has a digital reverb. And yes, that's correct. So the difference here is the digital reverb after the preamp section versus digital reverb before the amp. So you're getting, with the pedal, you're getting the amp's breakup with the reverb before it, and it contributes to that breakup, where with the spring reverb built into the amp, or if you were using an effects loop, you would get that breakup after the preamp section, which really changes in a big way the character of that sound. So what I'm going to do is how I typically like to set this. So I have the amp still spring reverb at noon, so pretty even how we've been using it a lot. I'm going to turn the mix on the pedal down fairly low. The mix is set about 9 o'clock or even 8 o'clock, so super low. And this is going to give, I'm actually going to go back to, no, I'll play the same riff, even though it's pretty sharp. But so this is with just the amp reverb. Now, if I turn that pedal on, once again, the mix is set really low now. This is just going to add a little bit of different flavor, and I'll explain how I might use this after I show it. So what I would do if I was writing a song using this setup, I would have those chords be just the amp reverb. It lets that chord attack shine through, but lets the reverb still fill out that space. And I would turn the pedal on when I go to that higher arpeggiated part. That just adds a little bit of extra space. So that's no pedal. And this is with the pedal. It's just a tiny bit of extra space because I have that mix set low. I could turn it up a little bit more and do the same thing. And you'll hear, in a way, this is sort of boosting the amp, not in volume, but in how full the amp is over time. So, if I play a note and that curve kind of comes down with a natural guitar attack, but with the reverb, it really stretches out. So no pedal, just amp reverb. And then using the pedal kind of to add reverb as a way to add breakup, if that makes sense. So that's just kind of an interesting way, a difference between amp reverb and pedal reverb. It's a big thing that people ask. They say, if I have a reverb pedal, why would I want amp reverb? Especially on amps with the digital spring reverbs like the AC10, because you think, digital reverb. And although they can be exactly the same if the pedal was built, like say if we built a pedal that was just the spring reverb in a pedal, it wouldn't feel the same because it's in a different spot in your signal chain. So that's one big thing I wanted to show, and hopefully that clears things up. If not, please ask in the comments. Corollas asked again, what do you think about tube changes for the AC10? And is this AC10 that I'm playing stock? And the answer to that is yes, this amp is fully stock. It's been opened from our warehouse not too long ago, and I'm still on the original tubes. I haven't done anything to it. You are, of course, hearing it through my Universal Audio aux box because that gives us better audio than miking it up. So you're hearing it slightly differently than you would if you were in the room. That's just the nature of streaming and wanting to get the best quality. But this is fully stock, and I see some people wanting to change those tubes right away or swap the speaker right away. And I never really felt that was necessary. We did have at some time, some limited versions that came with upgraded tubes. And it does change the sound. Some tubes will give you a bit more of a vintage sound. Some will be a bit more responsive and bright and modern. And so it's really a matter of personal taste, but it's never a necessity. So don't let anybody, if you're looking at forums or talking to a friend, some people are somewhat stuck in that thought of you got to upgrade things to right out of the box. And that's never the case. We make sure these are perfect to go, and you don't need to self-service them ever. Tubes last a very long time. There are amps from the 60s with their original tubes that sound great. And if you ever need to change your tubes or do something like that, you can always contact our customer support, or we can get you in touch with an authorized service center. So you don't have to worry about any of that yourself. So, like I said, this is all stock that you're hearing, and I prefer to keep it that way, and it's a lot easier. You don't have to, leave your amp with a service center for a couple days or so. So, hopefully that helps. Feel free to ask any more comments in the chat, and we're going to keep moving with some of these more modern surf rock revival or lo-fi indie rock sounds. I'm going to move the pedal away just because we're back to all amp reverb. This is a song from one of our artists, Sad Girl. They just did a really nice stream for us on our Instagram last week. It was really great, talking about gear between Misha, who plays guitar in Sad Girl, and Carlos, who plays in Chicano Batman. And they had a really nice talk. That's on our IGTV. If you go to our Instagram profile, you can rewatch that anytime. And we do have more artist sessions coming every Thursday. So keep an eye on our Instagram for that. But this is a Sad Girl song that I turned the spring reverb up all the way because this song is just drenched in it. And this is like part of this sound, especially when you are hearing like the first Sad Girl EP. I don't know if they recorded it themselves or how they recorded it, but it has this really personal and at-home feel to it. With, a lot of us at home, it's a great time to record these kinds of songs. So turning that spring reverb all the way up gives you this sort of, welcoming feel. So there's this song. It's called Little Queenie by Sad Girl. Sorry, let me turn the gain down a little bit. I'm going to set the gain to about 10 o'clock. So that's getting us back to some of those like Surfer Girl, Beach Boys type tones, or even some of the splash of something like The Shadows, but with a bit more of a modern instrumentation. So you still get that really big splash, turning that spring reverb all the way up. And like I was saying with the Beach Boys section, when we looked at some of those songs, you can hear the difference in the way the song is structured, the way the chord progression is structured. That gives more of a classic surf rock sound versus a modern surf rock sound. And both are great, but that's a lot of time people ask, what are the exact settings? And sometimes there's wiggle room there to get the right sound. But what you're looking for is like, how do you get that Beach Boys sound? It's a specific chord progression type, things like that. So I mentioned that last week with the Beatles, and I wanted to mention it again because it is a big thing, I think. And when I'm learning some new style, if I get into a new genre and I'm learning some songs from that, a lot of times I'll look at the chord progressions to inform how I'm, then playing into the amp and how I'm setting the amp, as opposed to just trying to figure out those settings right away. So that is my, kind of advice on that. And then I have just two more things I want to show you. And then if you have any questions, we can talk about that. Otherwise, we'll start wrapping things up and, get into some streams later on in following weeks. But until the stream is done, I have a few things, and feel free to ask any questions. So what I'm going to do is turn the gain up a good amount. I'm going to set it to about 3 o'clock. So turned up a lot of the way. This will get the AC10 to really break up. And I'm going to turn that spring reverb down to about 1 o'clock. I'm going to turn down the volume a little bit too, just to compensate. And the bass is now set at 12 and the treble at 1. So we get this nice full, this really big full sound that is distorted. In fact, I am going to turn the treble down a little bit. So bass and treble both at noon. So a little bit more of that low end saturation. And from this, you can get, adjust the spring reverb to taste, but get some of those kind of garage rocky tones. You could do Arctic Monkeys kind of thing. That's really fun. You could do something more like VOCs or Ty Segall kind of thing. So, of course, that's in a lot of ways. If I turn the gain down or just turn my guitar volume to show, I can play that same riff, and it gives you this surf rock sound because the playing is very similar. But when you turn up that gain, it adds this thickness to it. Of course, the OCs with that song are probably using a fuzz pedal, something like that. But I showed this in the first AC10 stream, and I'll mention it again. The AC10 really emulates putting a fuzz pedal in front of it well if you just turn the bass up to get this more low-end saturation with the gain up, because the AC10 can get quite distorted. So that is more of a modern garage rock kind of thing, and you can do a lot with that. So Seth asked, what's the best setting combination of gain and volume to not wake up the baby? So that really depends on the kind of sound you're looking for. Like we've shown throughout the video, you can get clean, super clean, that classic Vox chime from this. You can also get these really distorted, thick, almost fuzz tones. And really what you want to do, if you were setting up live, you would want to set the gain how you like it, and then turn up the master volume until you were even with your band, or until the sound engineer told you that you're at the right level. But when you don't want to wake up the baby when you're playing at home, so our ears have this natural curve of the louder we're playing, the more thick it sounds or the more full it sounds. So sometimes the amps that don't have headphone outputs can struggle to do that, because you can certainly turn it down, and I could set this super clean or even distorted, and then set the gain down or the volume down at 0 and inch it up until I get to like maybe just like a centimeter above 0, and you'd have a comfortable volume to play at home and not wake the baby. Certainly if the baby is awake, or you're home alone, you could turn it up beyond that, like I am now. But when you set it that low, sometimes your ear hears it as sounding differently because of the way our ears hear different frequencies. So it'll sound a little bit thinner. A great way around that is using our amp plugs. The AC30 amp plug does a really great version of this, just with headphones right on, and you won't wake up anybody, even if the baby's sitting right next to you. Also, the Cambridge 50 has a headphone output that has that new tube in the preamp section to give that responsiveness, a little give and take, where the amp plug does not have the new tube. And the Cambridge 50 or Mini Super Beetle also has a headphone output. Those you can then turn up when you want to play through the speaker. So there are some options for you. AC10 could do it, but not waking the baby can get tricky. So, we have those alternatives: amp plugs, Cambridge 50, Mini Super Beetle. So just a few more things before we wrap up. When I was kind of getting into with these more distorted surf rock-y tones, is there's actually a lot of early punk and kind of proto-punk, 70s punk, things like that, bands that were basically playing surf rock into distorted amps, but they had a different attitude, and the drummer played differently, and the singer sang really weird, like the Cramps, or to some degree the Undertones, some of their songs, even some Dead Kennedys stuff. I think, one of the classic surf rock riffs in my mind is actually Police Truck, just from playing Tony Hawk Pro Skater enough. That isn't a surf rock song, but it's kind of copying the chord progression from an old from Wipeout. No, it's not from Wipeout. I can't think of. It's Pipeline, from Pipeline. If I turn the gain down real quick, so if you take that and turn the gain up, this isn't exactly the Dead Kennedy song, but you get this kind of interesting punk surf sound that I think a lot of these early punk bands were using because surf rock has this attitude to it. So there's a lot of variability in how you play and how you set your amp. From here, I just want to show one last modern song that's taking kind of the combination of these two, that punk surf rock thing, and also the more dreamy, like Courtney Barnett kind of thing. This is a song by Title Fight. On this song, they're kind of experimenting the in-between of these spacey, surf rocky spring reverb tones, but also more of a, chilled out. They would later get into this kind of shoegaze thing. So it's this in-between, and I want to show this because spring reverb does it so well. A lot of people think you need another reverb pedal before your amp or something, but just turning the amp gain up and turning the spring reverb on is just beautiful. So I'm going to show you this Title Fight song. So that shows you kind of taking the spring reverb beyond, that splash that we typically think of spring reverb as. You can really turn it into this full, shoegazy or psychedelic or, all kinds of different things just by changing the way you set the gain, bass, and treble. So there we had the gain up, the bass up, and the treble down a little bit to get that full. But if I turn the gain back down to about 11 o'clock, the bass down to about 10 o'clock, and the treble up to about 1, to turn the volume up a little to compensate. You can play the same thing, play with the same playing with your picking hand. You don't have to do that kind of splash thing that we showed earlier, but you get those wide variety of tones just in adjusting your amp settings or in adjusting your playing style. So there's a lot of, I wanted to show that just because there's a lot beyond the typical spring reverb that I think of and you might think of. So hopefully that helps. Seeing some comments from Seth and Corollas and a few others, Mike, that are really into this. Corollas says he's definitely getting one. The spring reverb, if that's what you're looking for, any AC amp will do it, except for the AC4, which doesn't have reverb. But the AC10, AC15, AC30, however you want to go, you won't be disappointed. It's such a classic spring reverb sound. And we did all of this without an external reverb pedal. We just used that as an example to show the difference. So lots of cool stuff. I'm going to play out on that Pipeline song. It's a fun one, so I'm just going to play it a bit. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments, and I'll answer them. If not, we'll end the stream and see you next week for another stream, another Out of the Office with a different amp. Also, keep an eye out on our Instagram. We have Q&As and quizzes on our Instagram story, as well as live videos with artists every Thursday. So keep an eye out for all of that, and keep an eye out here on Facebook for the future of these streams. So thank you for joining us. I'm glad that we could talk about some reverb for a while. So thank you. Awesome. Thank you all.